if the peace we seek is less a prize to be won than a room we are invited back into? There is a soft kind of knowing that arrives when the rush of tasks and the barter of selves fall away and one recognizes an older habitat beneath the frantic surface. Black Elk names it as first peace, a primary accord with the lattice of being that supports us, soil, star, breath, and other hearts alike. It is not the peace of temporary relief or political ceasefire. It is the slow tide of realization that you are woven into a larger pattern, and that your pulse is not a solitary drum, but one voice in an enormous chorus. Imagine a field after rain. At first glance, the scene is a jumble: mud, stray leaves, puddles reflecting a gray sky. But if you stoop and listen in patience, you perceive the subtle choreography, the way the soil exhales, the tiny tongues of fern uncurling, the bead of water sliding towards seed. This attentiveness parallels the inner work of peace. When human attention softens, the threads that connect us to world and neighbor come into view. The discovery is simple and radical. We are not islands. We are nodes in a living web. This recognition shifts priorities. Choices cease to be isolated transactions and become acts that resonate across the field that contains us. There is moral consequence to this realization. To feel oneself in relation with the whole is not sentimental altruism, but an ethical reorientation. It changes how resources are used, how speech is given, how anger is met. If your breath and another's breath are part of the same atmosphere, then harming the other is not merely an external wrong, but a disturbance of the very air you share. The peace Black Elk speaks of is thus a practical teacher. It grounds decisions in interdependence rather than in the concealed ledger of personal gain. Policy, intimacy, labor, all are reframed by the recognition that the self's flourishing is not separable from the soils and the rivers. This peace does not erase conflict. The earth itself contains seasons of disruption, storms that fall the tallest pines, fires that cleanse old growth. Similarly, the realization of oneness does not produce passivity or naive concord. Rather, it gives a steadier center from which to engage turmoil. When one perceives connection, anger becomes a messenger about damaged ties rather than a fuel for permanent retaliation. Grief becomes a shared river in which one can be buoyed by others. Action becomes guided by repair rather than by escalation, by mending rather than by triumph. Cultivating this root of peace requires practices of attention that are ordinary and repetitive. Walking slowly, naming what you see without rushing to judgment, listening to the breath until it registers as a communal current. These micro-gestures accumulate. They train perception to catch the subtle geology of interbeing. Rituals matter not because they are magical, but because they habituate the mind toward relational sight. Over time, the interior climate shifts. Suspicion thins. The reflex to hoard loosens, and a steadier generosity becomes possible. There is a paradox in belonging. It enlarges agency while it dissolves the fantasy of isolated control. Knowing that one is part of a living web does not make one helpless, it makes one accountable. The first piece, therefore, carries with it a discipline, one of attentiveness and repair. It asks us to notice where our actions fray the net, and to learn the craft of mending. apology, restitution, thoughtful restraint. The ethics of oneness are not airy buzzwords, but the patient crafts of everyday reparative practices. If the field beneath our feet can teach us how to live, what might it ask of our hands when we next set about choosing, speaking, or loving? The field beneath our feet asks of our hands a different manner of touch, and that asking arrives as a patient curriculum rather than a loud command. Having noticed the soil's choreography and felt the subtle tether to river, tree, and neighbor, one begins to perceive how choices spread like rootlets under the surface. The recognition of interdependence does not dissolve agency, it refines its aim. Where once decisions were cast as isolated acts, they become stitches in a larger cloth. The question is no longer merely what will satisfy me now, but what pattern will these stitches contribute to the fabric that holds us all. Imagine walking through a wood after seasons of harvesting. Paths that once seemed clear now show small interventions, a fallen log redirected, a sapling given space, moss left intact where an impatient foot might otherwise disturb it. The wise walker learns a manner of passage that honors the existing weave. This manner is neither timid nor domineering. It is an attentive economy of impact. Attention becomes an ethical tool. To notice the soft places first, to recognize where a word or a convenience would crush a tender shoot, to allow the land its own time and rhythm. In human terms, this translates into decisions that respect cycles. Grief allowed its seasons, joy not squandered, work paced to preserve soil and relationship. Such restraint is not asceticism, but fidelity to a larger intelligence. The recognition that our acts ripple, that a bent will in one life can tilt the horizon of many, creates a modesty of will. Ambition does not vanish, it is redirected. Projects aimed solely at aggrandizement begin to look parochial beside undertakings that cultivate common good. Repairing a neighbor's fence, sharing water rights at times of drought, tending a communal plot, speaking truth in ways that repair rather than wound. This redirection asks for small renunciations, the quick sale, the easy judgment, the convenience that costs someone else a shore. These are not sacrifices performed for virtue's sake, but adjustments that preserve the tissue of belonging. There is also a flip side. The earth's generosity teaches reparative courage. Sometimes the weave has been heavily frayed by neglect or violence, and mending requires more than gentle stitches. It asks for steady, sometimes painful, intervention, calling out harm, making restitution, reshaping institutions that have calcified into extraction. The peace rooted in oneness does not romanticize passivity. It supplies a compass. Act where repair is possible. Accept the discomfort of accountability, and prefer restoration to rhetorical peace. In this way, the interior serenity becomes a source of ethical insistence, not complacent acquiescence. Metaphor helps. Think of a river that remembers its bed. After floods, the water does not merely resume its course. It deposits new silt, carves new banks, invites different species. Those who live by its side must adapt their practices, planting farther from the highest tide, building terraces that slow erosion, sharing water at times of drought, To live in union with such a river is to accept constraints that are generous in origin and wise in consequence. The constraints are not obstacles to freedom, but shape-giving frames that make flourishing possible for many lives at once. Attention, then, becomes a practice scaffolded by small rituals, daily acts, walking barefoot when possible, pausing before consuming, listening to a neighbor's complaint without reducing it to complaint. Cultivate a habit of repair rather than indifference. Over time, the nervous system learns a different default, an orientation toward reciprocity in place of acquisitiveness, a habit of mending in place of exploiting. This is not overnight redemption, but a slow reweaving of character. There is a paradox at the heart of this transformation. The more one accepts limits in service of the whole, the more one's own interior freedom enlarges. Boundaries that once felt like constraint begin to feel like the ribs of a heart, frames that allow the organ to contract and expand, to pump life outward without collapsing inward. The peace that is interior becomes the practical organizer of daily life, translating contemplative insight into the ethics of bread, house, and speech. As the day dims and you stand at the edge of the field again, the image returns. Hands set to mending, spade making a slow trench, a child learning to move rocks without crushing the nest beneath. What small stitch will your next decision add to the weave? And in what quiet way might that stitch deepen the first piece into a durable practice for the lives around you? The hands that set to mending in the dusk do not work for praise. They press the earth in rhythms that teach muscle and mind a different grammar. From the slow trench and the careful lifting of stones, there comes a sound like reconciliation, a low ordering that moves through the body and into the way one breathes. The child who learned to spare the nest now watches a small miracle. The place that was frayed is holding again. This household of repair is the living proof of the first piece. The inner calm that notices connection becomes the outward habit that sustains it. There is a moment when repair ceases to feel like doing and becomes a manner of being. The spade is laid aside, and the hands, still earth-stained, cup a small seed as if it were a contained world. In that gesture, the whole argument is decided, not by doctrine, but by fidelity. Peace is not a theoretical assent to interdependence. It is this kind of attending, the daily attentions that put down anchors against drift. The ethical life, in this sense, is liturgically small, the steady tending of what sustains life until the tending itself becomes a prayer whose syllables are practical acts. We have spoken of restraint, of reweaving markets of attention into tapestries that can hold more lives. Now the horizon tightens into a particular image. A riverbank where terraces have been rebuilt to slow runoff, where a communal bench has been carved from an old stump, where conversations happen without hurry because the people who sit there have learned to wait for one another's truth. In such places, the logic of separation begins to look like a worn costume. The natural posture reasserts itself, to lean toward, to notice, to repair. The first piece thus translates into public forms: allocation of water, distribution of food, conversation that insists on hearing the hidden terms. Transformation arrives not as a single thunderclap, but as a series of small agreements between neighbor and neighbor, between oneself and the land. Consider the ethic embedded in choosing slightly less for immediate pleasure so that soil has time to recover. Consider the courage of naming a past harm and inviting a process of restitution. Consider the patience to stay present in grief rather than turning grief into an identity. Each of these choices is a stitch in a garment that will outlast any individual season. The field's memory is long, and the gestures that sustain it accumulate into a culture of repair. There is a paradox worth holding. The more we accept that we are woven into a larger whole, the more individual responsibility grows. Oneness does not dilute accountability, it intensifies it. If our choices ripple outward, then our small acts acquire moral weight. To walk lightly becomes not an abdication of agency, but its most careful exercise. The courage to choose restraint, to mend, to speak truth in love, to redistribute, to stay present with another's pain, these are the new virtues born of the awareness of interdependence. At a certain point, the inner and outer loops close together. The peace that was first noticed in the quiet of the self becomes a habit of relation, and that habit returns to reinforce the inner calm. You find yourself less thrown by sudden loss because the field around you is already practiced in mutual support. You find decisions less solitary because the weave supplies counsel. This reciprocity is not utopian, it is pragmatic. It is the difference between a damaged shore constantly requiring emergency fixes and a shore that has been terraced and learns to hold the sea's moods. The climax of this reflection is not rhetorical flourish, but a contemplative quiet. Imagine standing on that riverbank at dawn, mist lacing the water, terraces dark against the registering light. A pair of hands reaches, without fanfare, to lay yet another stone where erosion once chewed the bank, and a neighbor passes a mug of tea without ceremony. There is no crowd to witness. The act's witness is the living earth and the steady continuity of shared labor. In that small scene, something like revelation occurs. Peace is not the end of conflict, but the art of living with conflict in a way that refuses its conversion into permanent fragmentation. As the final frame, hold the image of a hand closing a loop, tying a cord around a stake, smoothing soil over a seed, pausing to listen to a child's uneven song, and let the breath find a residence in the ribs that is not tremor but steadiness. The moral contour of our lives is not rewritten overnight. It is slowly redrawn by gestures that learn the vocabulary of mutual belonging. The first piece is not a line we cross and never return from. It is a field we cultivate season by season, stitch by careful stitch. Let the last sensation be the hush of soil settling after hands have worked, not a silence of absence, but the soft hush of things arranging themselves into right relation. In that hush, the question that remains is tender and exact. When your hands next choose, will they be the hands that mend, that tend, that remember how intimately you are held by the living web?